When did a funeral make you want to shatter the piece? The moment I saw Aunt Carol's face, serene in the casket yet undeniably gone, I knew this wasn't just about grief. This was about money, about legacy, and about the terrible, gnawing question of whether silence, even well-intentioned, could be a form of complicity. I was Stephanie Williams, 39F, typically the practical problem solver, but standing there, watching my cousin Shirley preen in a designer dress, I felt a tremor of something far less logical than usual, a visceral urge to disrupt everything, an urge that usually, frankly, wasn't me. It was a funeral, for crying out loud. Aunt Carol, bless her cotton socks, had been the anchor of our family, the quiet eye of the storm that was the Ivanov side, and now, without her, the storm was brewing. The air in the funeral home chapel was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and unspoken resentment, a combination that always made my stomach clench. Shirley Ivanov, 51F, Aunt Carol's only daughter, was gliding around the room, accepting condolences with the grace of a queen receiving homage. She was meticulously put together, not a hair out of place on her perfectly coiffed blonde bob, her black dress tailored to perfection, probably cost more than my mortgage payment. Her face, usually etched with a permanent frown of mild dissatisfaction, was now softened by an artificial, almost beatific sorrow. It was the family's golden child, always had been, despite a litany of questionable life choices that somehow always managed to land her back on her feet, usually with Aunt Carol's quiet financial assistance. While the rest of us were out here building careers and paying bills, Shirley had been flitting from one artistic endeavor to another, each one more expensive and less lucrative than the last, all funded by Aunt Carol's surprisingly deep pockets. We all knew where Aunt Carol's money came from, or rather, where it didn't. Certainly not from Shirley's abstract pottery that looked suspiciously like deflated balloons, or her short-lived foray into artisanal dog biscuits. I had arrived early out of habit and a desire to actually pay my respects before the circus began. It helped set up some of the photo displays, tried to make sense of the chaotic seating chart Shirley had scribbled on a napkin. As I pinned a photo of Aunt Carol laughing, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners, I felt a pang of genuine loss. Aunt Carol had always been good to me, a steady presence, a voice of reason in a family prone to dramatics. She had even given me a leg up with some advice when I started my small logistics consulting firm, urging me to focus on the human element of problem solving. My firm, Williams & Associates, was doing well, built on the very principles Aunt Carol had instilled: meticulous planning, foresight, and a healthy dose of cynicism about human nature. It was that cynicism, I think, that kept my emotional reaction to Shirley mostly in check. Mostly. Xavier Kim, 48M, Aunt Carol's longtime financial advisor and a family friend who'd known us since we were kids, was leaning against a wall by the entrance, a grim set to his jaw. He was a tall man, always impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed. His eyes, usually sharp and assessing, held a weary resignation. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last week. Xavier was a jaded veteran of many family dramas, not just ours, but he always had a soft spot for Aunt Carol. He'd helped her manage her investments, which, I'd gathered over the years, were substantial. It also, I suspected, been the quiet barrier between Shirley's more extravagant whims and Aunt Carol's dwindling reserves. When he saw me, he offered a small, tired smile. "Stephanie, good to see you under the circumstances." He pushed off the wall and came closer, his voice low. "Rough one." Carol was a force. She truly was, I agreed, my gaze sweeping past Shirley, who was now holding court near the podium. "Shirley seems to be taking it well." Xavier snorted, a brief, bitter sound. "Shirley is taking it as Shirley takes everything, like it's a performance staged for her benefit." He glanced around the nearly empty chapel, then leaned in a little. "Have you spoken to Dorothy?" My eyebrows rose. Dorothy Parker, 19F, was Aunt Carol's granddaughter, Shirley's daughter. She was a quiet, intense girl, often buried in books or her phone, a stark contrast to her mother's flamboyant nature. I hadn't seen much of Dorothy lately. Shirley, in her attempts to sculpt Dorothy into a miniature version of herself, had recently pulled her out of public school for some alternative arts curriculum she was supposedly overseeing, which mostly seemed to involve Dorothy doing Shirley's social media marketing for her latest venture. Soulful stones, polished rocks with alleged healing properties, currently being marketed as grief aids. "No, I haven't seen her," I admitted. "Is she here yet?" "She's in the family room." "Hasn't come out?" Xavier said, his gaze clouding. "She's been very agitated, more than usual, I mean. Look, Steph, there's something not right. Carol made some changes to her will very recently, very last minute, and Dorothy knows something. She was trying to tell me, but Shirley kept interrupting." My heart gave a little jolt. Aunt Carol was meticulous about her affairs. "Changes? Like what kind of changes?" Xavier just shook his head, looking frustrated. "Can't discuss the specifics, you know that, but let's just say, it's complicated, and Shirley isn't making it easy. She's insisting on handling everything, and she's already made it clear she's not interested in hearing any technicalities about the estate." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Just keep an eye out. And if Dorothy tries to talk to you, listen. She's a smart kid, even if she's a bit overwhelmed right now." That conversation gnawed at me. Aunt Carol wasn't impulsive, especially with legal matters. A last minute will change, coupled with Dorothy's agitation and Shirley's dismissive attitude, it set off all my internal alarms. I found myself subtly observing Shirley, the way she held herself, the way her eyes darted around the room, not settling on any one person for too long. She had that particular glint in her eye, the one that meant she thought she was in control, that she had all the cards. Few more relatives trickled in, hushed and somber, avoiding eye contact with Shirley as much as possible. Shirley, for her part, was now directing a hapless funeral home assistant on the exact placement of a particularly large flower arrangement, as if she were a theatrical director. She was even micromanaging the background music, insisting on a string quartet version of a pop song I vaguely recognized. It was all so very Shirley. Eventually, it was time for the service. Shirley had insisted on delivering the main eulogy herself. There had been some quiet grumbling from other family members, Aunt Carol's sisters mainly, who felt they should have a part, but Shirley had steamrolled them, citing her deepest connection as her only child. As she ascended the small steps to the podium, I saw Dorothy finally emerge from the family room, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She was clutching her phone, her knuckles white. She slipped into a seat in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous, but my eyes were drawn to her. There was a frantic energy about her, a silent plea. Shirley cleared her throat, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. Her voice, usually quite piercing, was softened into a mournful, almost theatrical cadence. She spoke of Aunt Carol's unwavering support, her infinite generosity, her unconditional love. She painted a picture of a mother-daughter bond that was idyllic, a partnership of kindred spirits. I exchanged a glance with my mother, Aunt Carol's sister, who sat beside me, her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. We both knew the reality. Aunt Carol had loved Shirley, yes, but her support had often been less about partnership and more about damage control, bailing Shirley out of one financial mess after another. Midway through Shirley's eulogy, as she was waxing poetic about Aunt Carol's love for all things beautiful and handcrafted, something odd happened. Shirley had insisted on having a large, flat-screen monitor placed beside the podium, purportedly to display a slideshow of Aunt Carol's life. Shed even bragged about how Shed personally curated the images. But instead of a faded photo of Aunt Carol as a young woman, a bright, blinking green light appeared on the screen, followed by the words, "Loading database, estimated time 30 seconds. A collective gasp went through the chapel. Shirley, caught off guard, stumbled over her words. "Oh dear," she murmured. "Technical difficulties, I suppose. Just a moment, everyone, it's meant to be a lovely tribute." The green light pulsed. The words changed. "Retrieving asset information. Warning, system integrity compromised." Shirley's face began to redden. Her composure, so meticulously maintained, was starting to crack. "I don't understand," she whispered, a little too loudly into the microphone. "I tested this, it was fine." Then a series of images began to flash across the screen, not of Aunt Carol, but of financial documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, and then, most damningly, a series of emails and text messages were clearly Aunt Carol's, addressed to Xavier, discussing various withdrawals and transfers. One particularly glaring text read, "Shirley just blew through the remaining trust fund. Again, I don't know what to do, Xavier. She's demanding more, threatening to cut me off." Another, more recent one, "I need to revise the will immediately. Everything to Dorothy. Shirley cannot be trusted. She's gambling away my future." The chapel was silent, save for the hum of the projector. Shirley stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror, fixed on the screen. The golden child facade had shattered. The text messages continued to scroll, revealing a painful narrative of Aunt Carol's financial desperation, her attempts to shield her assets from Shirley's relentless demands, and her growing fear for Dorothy's future. There were even references to a specific, very large sum of money that Shirley had recently borrowed for a startup venture that sounded suspiciously like a pyramid scheme involving rare earth minerals. I looked at Dorothy in the back row. She had dropped her phone. Her face was ashen, a mix of fear and grim satisfaction. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in them I saw a flicker of defiance. She knew, she must have known. The technology disaster wasn't random, it was orchestrated. Shirley finally found her voice, a strangled shriek that echoed in the hallowed space. "Turn it off! Someone turn it off! This is an outrage!" She lunged at the podium, fumbling for the power button on the projector, but she hit the wrong one. Instead of turning off, the screen froze on a particularly damning image. A recent transfer receipt for a significant amount from Aunt Carol's account directly into an offshore account in Shirley's name, dated just 2 days before Aunt Carol's sudden, unexpected passing. The caption below it read, "Final withdrawal unauthorized." The air crackled with shock and disbelief. Relatives whispered, their heads turning from the screen to Shirley, who was now hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of fury and humiliation. Her meticulously crafted image lay in ruins. She was no longer the grieving daughter, she was exposed. My mother gripped my arm, her nails digging into my flesh. "Stephanie," she hissed, "what in God's name is happening?" Xavier, who had been standing rigid with shock, suddenly moved, striding purposefully towards the podium. He took the remote from Shirley's trembling hand and pressed a button. The screen went blank, but the damage was done. The truth, ugly and raw, had been laid bare for everyone to see. Shirley spun around, her eyes blazing not at the screen but at the assembled mourners. "This is a fabrication, a malicious lie. Someone hacked into the system. This is an attack on my grief." Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "This is defamation. I will sue. I will sue every single person involved in this heinous act." Pointed a trembling finger at the back of the chapel, straight at Dorothy, who visibly flinched. You little sneak, you're behind this, aren't you?" Dorothy, usually so timid, slowly rose to her feet. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the silence like a knife. "It's all true, Mom, every word of it." The chapel erupted in murmurs. Shirley gasped, her face contorting. She took a step towards Dorothy, her hand raised as if to strike her. "Shirley, no," Xavier interjected, stepping between them. "Everyone, please, let's calm down. This is not the place." But it was too late. The dam had broken. Aunt Carol's will, her final wishes, the secret financial dealings, and Shirley's true character had all been brutally exposed. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer audacity, the deliberate, precise timing of it all. This wasn't a random glitch. This was an intentional act, a carefully planned digital ambush, and Dorothy was clearly at the center of it. The idea of legal action was no longer a distant possibility. It was an imminent reality, but the question wasn't just about recovering funds anymore. It was about trust, betrayal, and the unraveling of an entire family. And as Shirley stood there, sputtering threats of lawsuits and retribution, her eyes wild, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a very long, very messy battle. Shirley's shriek of you little sneak, you're behind this, aren't you? Hung in the air, a discordant note in the solemn space. Dorothy, small but suddenly resolute, stood her ground, her voice slicing through the thick tension. It's all true, Mom, every word of it. The collective gasp from the mourners was almost audible, a wave of shock rippling through the rows. My mother's grip on my arm tightened painfully, her eyes wide with a horrified fascination. Xavier, quick as a flash, had stepped between Shirley and Dorothy, his hand outstretched, a silent barrier. Shirley, no. Everyone, please, let's calm down. This is not the place. But it was too late for calm. The meticulously constructed facade of the golden child of the grieving daughter had shattered into a million pieces on the chapel floor, exposing the raw, ugly truth beneath. Shirley was beyond reason, her face blotchy, tears of rage rather than sorrow streaming down her cheeks. How dare you betray me like this? You're a child, you don't understand anything. This is slander. This is a criminal act. Have you arrested? I'll have you disinherited. You'll never see a dime. Her voice cracked, degenerating into a series of broken, guttural sobs that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. The relatives, previously whispering, now stood in stunned silence, some averting their gaze, others openly staring. A few brave souls, mostly Aunt Carol's older sisters who had long harbored quiet resentments, began to rise, their expressions a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction. Dorothy, though pale, held Shirley's furious gaze. I understand enough, Mom, she said, her voice still quiet but firm. I understand what Grandma wanted. I understand what you did. Her words were like daggers, each one hitting its mark. Shirley recoiled as if struck, her raised hand dropping to her side. The shock of her own daughter's public defiance seemed to momentarily stun her into silence. Xavier took advantage of the brief lull. Shirley, we need to leave. Now, this can't continue. He placed a firm hand on her arm, trying to guide her away from the podium. Shirley resisted, her eyes still locked on Dorothy, a look of pure hatred distorting her features. You will regret this, Dorothy, mark my words. With one final, venomous glare, she allowed Xavier to steer her out of the chapel, her sobs echoing in the stunned silence. Her exit was as dramatic and self-serving as her entrance, but this time, it was laced with the bitter taste of public humiliation. As soon as the door closed behind them, the chapel erupted in a cacophony of whispers, gasps, and murmurs. My mother finally let go of my arm, her face a mask of bewildered sorrow. My God, Stephanie, Carol? Carol knew, she must have known. I nodded, my mind racing. The technology disaster wasn't a random glitch. It was a carefully orchestrated exposure, and Dorothy, the quiet, bookish girl, was the architect. She had known the truth, had seen her grandmother's desperation, and had taken matters into her own hands. I looked at Dorothy, still standing in the back, her shoulders slumped now that the adrenaline had faded, but her chin still held high. She caught my eye, and for the first time I saw not just fear, but a weary determination. My practical problem-solver brain kicked into overdrive. This wasn't just about a will anymore. It was about family, about justice, and about the long, messy aftermath of a lifetime of entitlement. Legal action wasn't just a possibility, it was an inevitability. 2 weeks later, the air in Xavier's downtown office was thick with the scent of stale coffee and impending litigation. The immediate aftermath of the funeral had been chaotic. Shirley had retreated into a furious silence, punctuated by threats of lawsuits against anyone and everyone who had witnessed her public downfall. She had tried to have Dorothy removed from the house, but Aunt Carol's will, as revealed by Xavier in a private, much calmer meeting the day after the funeral, contained a clause granting Dorothy immediate occupancy of Aunt Carol's home, a move clearly designed to protect her granddaughter from Shirley's whims. This had only fueled Shirley's rage. Xavier, true to his word, had assembled us, myself, my mother, and a few other key family members who were named as secondary beneficiaries or executors, along with Dorothy. He had also brought in a calm, sharp-eyed probate lawyer, Ms. Evelyn Thorne, whose presence alone seemed to lower the room's temperature by several degrees. As you all witnessed, Xavier began, his voice weary but firm, the display at the funeral was unfortunately accurate. Carol had become increasingly concerned about her assets, specifically in relation to Shirley's expenditures. She had, in fact, changed her will less than a week before her passing. He laid out a document on the table, crisp and formal. The most significant change was the designation of Dorothy as the primary beneficiary of her estate, with a substantial portion also placed in a trust for her education and future, managed by myself and Stephanie. My head snapped up. Me, a trustee. I looked at Xavier, who offered a small, apologetic shrug. Aunt Carol knew you were meticulous, Stephanie, and trustworthy. She explicitly requested it. I swallowed, a mix of apprehension and pride swelling within me. Aunt Carol's faith in me was humbling and daunting. As for the recent, unauthorized transfer, Ms. Thorne interjected, her voice smooth and professional, that is where the legal action comes into play. It appears to be a fraudulent wire transfer, executed under duress, or perhaps through sophisticated manipulation, just 2 days before Ms. Ivanov's passing. The amount is substantial. She looked at Dorothy. Dorothy, we need to understand how you managed to obtain those documents and display them. Dorothy, still visibly shaken but determined, took a deep breath. Grandma taught me about technology. She knew I was good with computers. She was teaching me about her finances, about investing, because she said she wanted me to be prepared, unlike Mom. A bitter edge crept into her voice. She said she was scared. Mom was pressuring her constantly. Grandma told me she was trying to change her will, but Mom kept isolating her, making it difficult for her to meet with Xavier alone. Grandma was worried Mom would just take everything. She paused, her eyes welling up. Grandma told me she was afraid she wouldn't have time. She made me promise that if anything happened, I would make sure her wishes were known. She gave me access codes, told me where to find everything, just in case. She had a hidden hard drive with all the details, all the communications, everything. She said if I couldn't get the will updated officially, I should find a way to show everyone the truth. My jaw clenched. Aunt Carol, the quiet anchor, had been preparing Dorothy for this moment. It was a brutal revelation, a testament to the depths of Shirley's manipulation and Aunt Carol's quiet desperation. The night before the funeral, Dorothy continued, her voice gaining strength, I was helping Mom set up the monitor for the slideshow. She gave me her laptop and the USB drive. I knew what Grandma wanted me to do. It was the only way. I linked the hidden hard drive to the presentation software, set a timer. I didn't want to do it, but I promised Grandma. I had to. There was a collective intake of breath. The young girl who had seemed so timid had orchestrated a digital coup, exposing her mother's perfidy to the entire family. It was a startling act of courage, born of desperation and loyalty. Ms. Thorne nodded, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. This certainly complicates things for Shirley. Her claim of defamation holds little water when the evidence came directly from the deceased's own records, facilitated by a direct instruction to her granddaughter. She turned to me. Stephanie, given your expertise in logistics and problem solving, and your appointment as a co-trustee, we'll need your assistance in tracing this offshore account and preparing a comprehensive financial affidavit. This will be a multi-pronged legal battle. Shirley is already threatening countersuits, alleging manipulation of her mother and a conspiracy against her. She's likely to dispute the will's validity due to its sudden change. My involvement had gone from observation to active participation. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. It was a high-stakes legal battle, and I was on the front lines. The thought filled me with a familiar mix of dread and exhilaration. It was a problem, and I was a problem solver. 3 months had passed since the funeral, and the initial shock had slowly morphed into simmering resentment within the family, divided along clear lines. Some, mostly those who had directly benefited from Aunt Carol's generosity and Shirley's past manipulations, sided with Shirley, clinging to the narrative of Dorothy's betrayal. Others, the majority, recoiled from Shirley's increasingly erratic behavior and supported Dorothy, though often from a safe distance. Legal proceedings were moving at a glacial pace, as expected. Shirley, represented by a notoriously aggressive lawyer, had indeed challenged the will, claiming undue influence and demanding a full accounting of Aunt Carol's assets, implying that Xavier and even Dorothy had somehow defrauded her mother. She had also filed a restraining order against Dorothy, citing emotional distress and harassment, which Ms. Thorne quickly had dismissed. My role as co-trustee, alongside Xavier, had become all-consuming. I spent countless hours poring over financial documents, tracing transactions, and preparing our case. My logistics skills, usually applied to shipping routes and supply chains, were now focused on the complex flow of money and legal strategy. It was exhausting, but also strangely fulfilling. I saw Aunt Carol's quiet strength in every meticulously kept ledger, every cautionary note she had left. I discovered more layers of Shirley's financial irresponsibility, her secret gambling debts, her failed ventures that had bled Aunt Carol dry. There was a moment when I found an old, faded photo tucked inside a ledger, Aunt Carol holding a tiny baby Shirley, both smiling, so full of hope. It was a stark reminder of the love that had been exploited. My perception of Shirley was evolving. While the entitlement was still infuriating, I began to see the fear beneath it, the desperate clinging to a life she felt she was owed, rather than earned. It didn't excuse her actions, but it made her a more complex villain, a product of a dynamic that had gone unchecked for decades. And Dorothy, the quiet girl, had blossomed. Living in Aunt Carol's house, which she had carefully begun to organize and redecorate, she seemed to shed layers of timidity. She was actively involved in the legal process, providing detailed timelines of her mother's demands and her grandmother's increasing distress. She started attending community college, taking a few online courses in computer science and business, slowly building a future for herself, independent of her mother. I found myself admiring her resilience, her quiet determination. One afternoon, while reviewing some old bank statements, I found a small recurring payment from Aunt Carol's account to a seemingly random charity. It was a modest sum, nothing that raised an alarm. But as I dug deeper, cross-referencing names, I realized something. This charity was actually a small, discreet fund for struggling artists and musicians, anonymously administered. A note tucked away in Aunt Carol's digital files confirmed it. Shirley has such talent, it read, in Aunt Carol's elegant script, but she struggles with the practicalities. This fund allows her to receive support without knowing where it comes from, preserving her dignity and my peace of mind. My breath caught. Aunt Carol hadn't just bylaid Shirley out. She had built a system, however flawed, to anonymously fund her daughter's artistic endeavors while trying to maintain some semblance of financial control. It was a twisted form of enabling, born of love and a desire to avoid confrontation, but enabling nonetheless. It made me wonder how many times I, or other family members, had silently enabled Shirley's behavior, avoiding discomfort, allowing Aunt Carol to bear the brunt. My own practical problem solving had often involved avoiding the messiest parts of human interaction. Perhaps I hadn't been an accomplice in Shirley's specific financial schemes, but I had certainly been a bystander in the broader family dynamic that allowed Shirley's entitlement to flourish. This realization was a quiet, uncomfortable twist, a reminder that complicity comes in many forms, not just active participation. 6 months after Aunt Carol's funeral, the dust began to settle, though not entirely. Legal battle with Shirley was far from over, but the tide had definitively turned in our favor. Ms. Thorne had meticulously built a case so strong, so irrefutable, that Shirley's aggressive lawyer was struggling to find a foothold. The detailed financial records, combined with Aunt Carol's explicit instructions to Dorothy, and the sheer volume of evidence of Shirley's reckless spending, painted a damning picture. The final nail in Shirley's coffin came not from our efforts, but from an unexpected twist. During a routine discovery phase, Shirley's lawyer had accidentally submitted a file containing encrypted communications. A sharp junior associate on our team, working late, managed to decrypt them. They were conversations between Shirley and a shadowy financial consultant who had facilitated the offshore transfer. Consultant had, in fact, been pressuring Shirley for payment on other, unrelated, and highly illegal schemes she had been involved in, suggesting that the offshore transfer from Aunt Carol's account was not just borrowed, but part of a desperate attempt to cover other illicit debts. This revelation immediately led to a separate, much more serious investigation by financial authorities, pulling the rug out from under Shirley's legal defense and effectively sidelining her lawyer's aggressive tactics. Focus shifted from the will dispute to actual criminal charges against Shirley. The family was reeling from this new level of exposure, but there was also a collective sigh of relief. Shirley's entitlement had finally reached a point where the law, not just family dynamics, was stepping in. The case of Aunt Carol's will, while still contested by Shirley from afar, now seemed a mere formality compared to the much larger storm she had created for herself. The trust for Dorothy was secure, and a significant portion of Aunt Carol's estate, once recovered, would go to Dorothy. Shirley's share, as per the original unamended will, was effectively nullified by the scale of her fraudulent activity. Dorothy, now a few months into her college courses, looked lighter, more confident. She had reconnected with her father's side of the family and was building a life carefully and thoughtfully. She still visited Xavier's office regularly, not just for legal updates, but for advice on her studies, on managing her burgeoning independence. She had even started a small, online platform for artists, one that actually provided practical business advice and fair compensation, a direct antithesis to her mother's exploitative ventures. She was slowly, but surely transforming the legacy of her grandmother's quiet resilience into something strong and vibrant. My own role as trustee was evolving. It was no longer just about legal battles, but about careful stewardship, about ensuring Dorothy's future was secure and that Aunt Carol's intentions were truly honored. I found myself thinking more about the human element, as Aunt Carol had always advised. It wasn't just about the money, it was about protecting a young woman from the shadow of her mother's destructive entitlement, about building something positive out of chaos. I had grown, too. My cynicism, usually a shield, had softened into a more nuanced understanding of human nature. I still believed in meticulous planning and foresight, but I now understood that some problems required not just logic, but empathy and a willingness to step into the messy fray. The quiet problem solver had found her voice, not just in business, but in her family. Shirley's legal battles would likely drag on for years, a testament to her entrenched patterns and the system's slow grind. She was no longer the golden child. She was simply a woman facing the consequences of a lifetime of taking. But for the rest of us, there was a tentative peace. Aunt Carol's last desperate act had paradoxically brought a strange kind of healing to the family. The hidden truths had been exposed, the rot aired out, and now, slowly, painfully, we could begin to rebuild. The funeral had been a beginning, not an end, a public unmasking that forced a reckoning. And as I looked at Dorothy, diligently working on her laptop in Aunt Carol's sunlit study, a quiet sense of hope bloomed. The legacy of entitlement was finally being broken, and in its place, something far more resilient, far more true, was beginning to take root.